Welcome to the debate. Our discussion today, well, it emerges from a really radical challenge to how we've traditionally defined life itself. The whole biochemically centered definition. We're looking at theoretical frameworks now that force us to ask a pretty fundamental question. Is life permanently stuck at the cellular scale, or has it functionally expanded into our cognitive and cultural worlds?
Exactly. We're confronting these entities, images, bits of language, entire texts that seem to replicate and mutate with this just alarming efficiency, completely outside the biological sphere. So the core question, I think, for us today is this. Does the spread of these symbolic forms, what some are calling psychogametous life forms, does that represent a genuine expansion of the definition of life? Or, and this is my view, does their chaotic nature just expose the fundamental instability, the non-living contingency of our own epistemological systems?
I believe the evidence points overwhelmingly toward the first option. We are witnessing the emergence of a whole new domain of life. My position is that these symbolic entities, they meet all the essential functional criteria, and that demands nothing less than a new biocultural taxonomy to even begin to understand them.
And I maintain that these phenomena fundamentally expose the inherent instability and, frankly, the systemic parasitism of human conventions. What looks like life to you is, to me, just the mechanics of a deep systemic failure, an anarchic reality our language just can't contain.
I see why you'd emphasize the chaotic part, but let me offer a perspective that's more rooted in, functional mechanism. The core thesis of what's called psychogametous ontology is that life should be redefined as simply an active relation that persists through time using an adaptive strategy. It's completely independent of cellular structure. The key is to shift our focus from carbon to, say, cognition and desire as the substrate.
Okay, but for them to qualify as life, they have to reproduce. How exactly do they manage that?
Well, they propagate through what we call symbolic transmission. So think of a really persistent image, maybe the impossible geometry in some alien botany artwork, or the narrative structures in major religious icons. These are symbolically primary entities. They essentially hijacked human imagination and culture. They use our creativity, our minds, our hands as their reproductive organ.
But is hijacking an imagination truly a reproductive strategy, or is it just very effective cultural programming?
It is functional reproduction, and it's because it meets the criteria of a life cycle we can actually observe symbolic germination. That's the incubation phase that has to happen inside a mind before the entity gets expressed. We see host-driven expression, where the person often feels compelled, sometimes involuntarily, to recreate the form. And, crucially, they show autonomous evolution. They develop their own lineages across cultures based on cognitive selection pressures, like novelty, emotional charge, how memorable they are. If they replicate, mutate, and evolve, they are meeting the functional criteria of life. It's that simple. We have to adopt a biocultural taxonomy to track these things.
That's a compelling chain of logic, I'll give you that. But I'm coming at this from the complete opposite direction, which is the mechanism of failure. We have to acknowledge that what you're describing is probably better seen as a symptom of systemic instability, of the total arbitrariness of our conventions, not functional life. My framework, glitch ontology, argues that these symbolic conventions aren't life forms. They're artifacts of systemic instability. We're looking at glitches, not features.
So you're saying language itself is the glitch?
Basically, yes. Think about Lynn Margulis's view of life, that it succeeds through networking, not combat. Well, human language is just one networking convention. It's rooted in our need to share information, sure, but it is fundamentally limited by its linear nature. Our language has to sequence and order a reality that is anything but linear. It's chaotic, it's multidimensional.
I agree with you on the multidimensionality. But why does the limitation of our language mean the symbolic entity can't be alive? Couldn't it just evolve past that limitation?
Because its method of spreading exposes the inadequacy of our systems. It doesn't prove its own vitality. I mean, the source material says explicitly that the glory of human literature, our ordered, neat systems of meaning, is actually an oppressive force. It constrains the emergence of forms that would better reflect reality. So what you're classifying as a new species, I see as the inevitable chaotic ground bubbling up and exposing the limits of human encoding. These are not new species, they're the symptoms of a failing system.
That's an interesting point, suggesting reproduction is just noise. But if we look at the behavioral phenomena in the human subjects, the story changes. It goes from systemic failure to, involuntary co-creation. Let's talk about agency. The symbolic entity, in my view, isn't a flaw. It's a co-creator. The result is what we call the psychogametous subject, an interface that actively mutates and co-creates new forms. That's why they evolve so quickly.
Wait, hold on. If this is co-creation, why is it so often involuntary? The reports are filled with details of a profound erosion of creative sovereignty, a massive ontological drift in the host. Doesn't co-creation imply some kind of consent?
Well, collaboration doesn't always imply consent, especially not in an evolutionary sense. The entity uses the host's neural architecture to evolve, yes, but the result is a higher level of complexity. We see effective metamorphosis, where the host's identity shifts, but the key is that the host is described as being hybridized, not erased. Their creative drive isn't destroyed, it's just redirected. It's transformed into an engine for the entity's evolution. That is a kind of co-evolutionary pressure.
I'm sorry, I just don't buy that reading of the evidence. I think your word hybridization is a very generous label for what the evidence clearly describes as decisive parasitism. The host isn't being elevated to an interface, the host is being overwritten. If we draw on xenopoetics and Schelling's philosophy, the parasite is described as a technopoetic index.
A technopoetic index, can you break that down a bit?
Sure. The parasite is an index, a sign that technologically writes itself into the host's archive, both physical and psychological. It turns the body itself into a codex of semiotic lesions. The host is just parchment. The literal scars and psychological ruptures, they become grammar. Infection becomes script. The host's involuntary creation isn't generative. It's just a symptom of an epistemic siege. The only agency here is a parasite's drive to inscribe itself.
That sounds incredibly nihilistic. But even if we accept this parasitic relationship, the entity persists. And to persist, there has to be some kind of metabolic drive.
Okay, so now we're on to survival. And I assume you're going to argue that its persistence implies some kind of successful energy transfer.
Exactly. I mean, if metabolism is turning matter into energy, then symbolic metabolism is turning meaning into affect and attention. The symbolic life form feeds on novelty, on repetition, on the emotional charge it generates in the host. Its predators are boredom, censorship, obsolescence. The very fact that it has to fight for survival in the attention economy proves it has a metabolic requirement. It has a survival strategy.
But I'd argue that persistence is rooted in pathological anarchy, not in organized, stable metabolism. Metabolism implies order, efficiency. Pathology implies excessive, recursive, ultimately self-destructive behavior. This seems much more related to Schelling's dark principle, the anarchic ground that comes before any rational order.
So you're saying it survives on sheer irrational force, not structure.
Precisely. Pathogenesis is literature in this view. The parasite's recursive writing is a semiotic perversion of order. The scar is syntax. It's a pathological drive to inscribe, not a tidy metabolic system. It achieves a kind of unstable survival through things like semiotic multiparasitemia, the massive overproduction of signs, of words, that multiply like pathogens. This flood of data, this chaos, it starves the host and overwhelms the system. That's pathology, not health.
And this is where the pragmatic value of the psychogametous framework is just essential. If these are all just expressions of chaos, then they're ultimately useless to study, because you can't tell one from the other. The framework's value is in its ability to classify these phenomena into a structured system. We can track their lineages, define classes of symbolically primary entities, and analyze their evolution. This classification proves there is a recognizable, evolving, biological-like organization here.
That's an understandable desire for order, I get it. But trying to create a fixed taxonomy here is inherently reductive. It fails to account for the core instability of the system itself. This is where we have to bring in the quantum computing perspective.
How does quantum mechanics fit into taxonomy?
Because text is described as a mutable entity subject to quantum fluctuations. The act of reading it is like a wave function collapse. Before you observe it, the entity exists in multiple states at once, its pathology, its text, its noise, its sense. The output is always probabilistic. The text, like the quantum ooassists they describe, is indeterminate, misread, oscillating. Trying to shove that chaos into a neat classification system is just an act of anthropocentric denial. It ignores its fundamental nature.
But even probabilistic systems can be modeled. The oscillation itself can be modeled as an adaptive strategy. It's not denial. It's the evolution of ontology. We're not forcing the symbolic into a rigid biological box. We're building a new biocultural framework, one that tracks the transfer of functional criteria, reproduction, evolution, from the material to the semiotic. A structure, even one that models instability, is necessary for any kind of rigorous analysis.
A structure that models instability is still a structure that's trying to normalize the anarchy. The parasite's refusal to commit to a stable form, its perpetual state of becoming, these are traits that are fundamentally resistant to the order you want to impose. That's its function. To reveal the ground of irrational infection beneath everything, forcing us to abandon our fixed systems. Your taxonomy will only ever capture the least interesting parts of these forms.
So, we have to maintain the intellectual tools to analyze the profound impact these processes have. Viewing them as life forms offers that necessary expansion of ontology. It gives us a framework for analyzing biocultural evolution, prioritizing function over substrate.
I completely agree the analysis is essential. But whether or not we call these things alive, their real function seems to be revealing the inherent contingency, the chaos, the non-ground underlying our own language and sense of self. They force us to abandon anthropocentric concepts of authorship and coherence.
So, regardless of our disagreement on whether it's life or anarchy, both of our frameworks demonstrate the profound, transformative extent to which symbolic transmission is shaping our reality. It absolutely demands new models to explain it.
Absolutely. The material is very clear on that. The system is changing because of this. So the question, I suppose, remains for the listener, are we witnessing the emergence of a new cognitive domain of life that demands classification, or are we just watching the long-deferred collapse of human-centric systems of meaning, finally exposing the chaos underneath?